Okay, thank you very much. Thank you and welcome to SIPRI. I'm going to give a short presentation about the issue of arms transfers and the conflict in Libya. But I will do that within the context of presenting you some information about arms transfers to the region of the Middle East and North Africa as a whole, to show you that the case of Libya is not an isolated case of arms transfers. If we look at the most recent SIPRI data about arms transfers, then we see that it shows, as usual, again, that the tension-rich region of the Middle East and North Africa is a key arms importing region. As a whole, the region of the Middle East and Northern Africa accounted for about 20% of worldwide total international transfers of major conventional weapons in the period 2006 to 2010. During that period, the bulk of the transfers to the Middle East and North Africa went to a limited number of countries. The UAE and Algeria were the largest importers, accounting for about 18% of the total import of major arms in that region. Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia each accounted for about 10% of the arms imports in the region. These countries are likely to remain important recipients of weapons, and especially Saudi Arabia is likely to increase as an arms recipient in the next decade. On the other end of the scale, you see also countries which, to some extent, maybe surprisingly enough, have not been able to import significant quantities of arms. And those include most prominently Syria and Iran, which presumably, mainly for financial reasons, have not been major importers of conventional arms in the past 20 years or so. On top of that comes, of course, that Iran, since mid last year, June 2010, is under a United Nations arms embargo and cannot buy major conventional weapons anymore. The weapons which are imported by the countries in the region equate to a large extent to total procurement of their arms, because the countries in the region do not have the indigenous industrial capability to produce their own weapons. Israel is to some extent an exception. It has an advanced military industry, but even that industry is not capable of producing major conventional weapons, such as, for example, combat aircraft or submarines. Now, if we look at the reasons for the arms procurement in the region, it is always very difficult to know for sure why that is happening. Countries tend to be intransparent, secretive about military matters. But in general, we can assume that at least among the main reasons for their arms procurement is perceived threats, either from other countries or perceived threats related to internal threats, such as threats to existing political systems by rebel groups or by the type of uprisings as we see now in a number of countries in the region. We see, for example, a reactive pattern of reactive arms procurement by Algeria and Morocco on one end of the region. We see on the other end a distrust between Arab Gulf states and Iran, which may feed their arms procurement. And we see, of course, also another example in Yemen, a rebellion which feeds both arms procurement in Yemen itself, but also in neighboring Saudi Arabia, which has seen a flow over of the Yemeni rebellion into its territory, and which explains some of its major plans to acquire advanced military equipment. Now, despite the fact that most countries in the region are dependent on arms imports, they still have access to a wide variety of very willing suppliers. Key arms suppliers to the region include the USA, the UK, and France, which have been supplying and marketing weapons to most countries in the region, except, of course, to Syria and Iran. And, of course, also Russia plays an important role, especially also because Russia has been willing to supply weapons to Syria, and up until last year, June 2010, also to Iran. At that point, of course, also Russia agreed with the UN arms embargo on Iran. Now, because the countries in the region are very dependent on arms imports, supply countries can play an important role in preventing excessive arms procurement in the region that may threaten regional peace or security. They may also play an important role in preventing arms procurement that could contribute to repressive regimes holding on to power. And such responsibility is to some extent accepted by the states in the world, and we see that very much reflected in the fact that the United Nations has currently 12 arms embargoes in place. 7 of those are arms embargoes on complete countries and also prohibit the supply of weapons to the governments of those countries. 3 of those are actually imposed on governments because of their involvement in conflict and also because of their use of violence against their own population. Now, in practice, however, of course, arms trade remains a controversial issue, and supplier restraint regularly fails. And we see that, for example, in the case of Libya, the most recent and obvious case I know at this point. What we saw in Libya in the beginning of this year, a very swift response by the United Nations Security Council. Within only 2 weeks of the start of the Libyan uprising, the UNSC decided unanimously to impose sanctions, including an arms embargo. Even China and Russia were willing to swiftly agree with such an embargo, something which they hadn't been doing in the past. Usually they had waited much longer. However, the unanimous condemnation of the regime of Gaddafi contrasts very starkly with the previously good relations it enjoyed with many governments in the world. From 2003, Libya's oil, the fact that it was a buffer against unwanted migration from Africa to Europe, the fact that it was a potential ally against Al-Qaeda were all reasons to welcome it back into the international community with open arms. Sanctions on Libya were lifted, and that included several arms embargoes. And as a result, after more than a decade of being cut off from supplies, Libya was expected to spend billions of dollars to modernize parts of its large arsenal of by then outdated equipment. And in anticipation to what was considered a lucrative market, many companies very eagerly competed to supply arms to Libya. And they didn't do that by themselves. They got a lot of support from their political leadership. For example, the leaders of France, Italy, Russia and the United Kingdom were all personally involved in supporting their national arms industries in their efforts to sell arms to Libya. And so what do we see then in the beginning of this year, in February, in March? We see that nations who were destroying the forces of Gaddafi were actually destroying some of the equipment which they had delivered or had been marketing up until just weeks before the actual airstrikes began. We saw that French aircraft were, for example, which had been marketed to Libya by France very eagerly, were bombing howitzers which had been supplied by Libya. The UK, also at the forefront of the military actions, sent in British planes to destroy Libyan tanks which had been equipped with British communication equipment just in the weeks or the years before. We also see that many countries were willing to supply small arms and light weapons. For example, the Ukraine, Russia, Italy and Belgium are all known to have supplied substantial numbers of small arms. And these weapons are now used by Gaddafi's forces. And also, the other issue, they may leak into conflicts in countries surrounding Libya. And to show just how easy arms restraints may fail, in one particular case, the authorities in Belgium allowed the supply of high-tech rifles to the regime of Gaddafi. And they argued that that was okay because Libya had assured them that those weapons were intended for use by Libyan troops protecting humanitarian aid convoys to Darfur. Obviously, now the weapons are used for very different purposes. Now, despite the relentless sales efforts by the arms companies, Libya had held back on contracts for new arms. It didn't buy that many weapons, and therefore you could argue that restraint in supplies of major weapons would not necessarily have stopped the current bloodshed. But of course you could also argue, on the other hand, that the eagerness of many states to market weapons, which are after all the symbols of power and the tools of repression, signaled support for Gaddafi's regime. Furthermore, if the violence had started later, or if Gaddafi had earlier been convinced by the suppliers of weapons to buy all the advanced equipment which they wanted to sell, then the presence of all that advanced equipment could have complicated the decisions about enforcement of the UN sanctions and also the actual enforcement themselves. Now, overall, the swiftness with which an arms embargo was imposed on Libya is very encouraging. However, it is clear that a critical evaluation of the arms policies towards Libya before the embargo would be very useful in order to assess how such policies may embolden authoritarian regimes and how commercial motives and narrow national interests may blind governments to the potential negative effects involved in arms trade. Now, not all lessons learned from the Libya case will be easily applicable to other situations in the Middle East and Northern Africa or elsewhere. In the case of Egypt, for example, it has been argued that just the military relation between the United States on the one hand and the Egyptian military, a military relation which involved a lot of military supplies, that military relation was paramount in the efforts which the USA successfully made to convince the Egyptian military to take, in the end, the side of the protesters and oust Mubarak. Now, such claims of potential benefits of arms transfers to the region are, of course, as important to assess as assessing the possible negative effects of arms transfers. And here at SIPRI, we will try to continue to contribute to this debate about arms transfers and the possible impact of arms supplies on security and ultimately peace. And we will be trying to do that by providing you and everyone else who is interested in these issues with accurate data and thorough analysis, I hope at least, which you can find back in such publications as the Yearbook 2011. And with that, I want to end this presentation and thank you for your attention.